The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
Continuing the video Bible reading of the book of Acts, this is number 35. And today we're starting in Acts chapter 12, in verses 1 through 5. We've had the gospel throughout Judea. We've had the gospel to the Samaritans. We've had the gospel going to the Gentiles. We've had the rise of the church, the Gentile church in Antioch by the hand of God, by the grace of the Lord. We've had Barnabas and Saul brought back into the storyline here. And as we pick up in Acts 12, verses 1 through 5, in the same time frame, this is not necessarily a specific chronological sequence from Acts 11, but in the same time frame, Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 5, about that time, so the same general time frame of the prophets going up to Antioch, Saul and Barnabas coming down to Jerusalem, about that time, Acts 12, 1 through 5 from the English Standard Version. About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword, and when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread. And when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out to the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer was made for him. Earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. Acts 12:1, about that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. Our best indication, as mentioned in the previous video lesson, is that the bad famine that affected Judea was in the mid-40s, around 44, 45, somewhere in that time frame. 45, 46, somewhere in that time frame. Herod the king was Herod Agrippa I. Luke is very specific with his nomenclature in describing these various people. There were a lot of guys named Herod, but Luke always gives us a distinctive to tell us which Herod we're talking about. This Herod the king was Herod Agrippa I. He was born in 10 BC. He died in 44 AD. And so that's the upper parameter for exactly when this storyline takes place. He's the son of Aristobulus, one of the sons of Herod the Great. So this Herod Agrippa I was the grandson of Herod the Great. Herod the Great being the one who killed the boys of Bethlehem in order to try and kill the Christ child. And after that was very, very soon after that, died of a horrible disease. So this is the grandson of Herod the Great. His father had been put to death by his grandfather because Herod the Great was very suspicious of the ambitions of his own children. This Herod Agrippa I, had been raised in Rome. He had a history of irresponsibility and bad behavior. I've seen the word playboy used in reference to him. He had gone bankrupt. He had debts outstanding that caused him to flee and to hide in foreign nations. He had a pretty bad history. Got him into trouble. He was in trouble with officials in imperial Rome several times, but in 37 AD, the Emperor Caligula had named Herod Agrippa I as king in northern Palestine. The former tetrarchies of Philip and Lysanias that are mentioned in Luke chapter 31 were given to Herod Agrippa I, and he was called king over those areas. And then when his uncle Herod Antipas, now Herod Antipas is the son of Herod the Great, and he is the one who killed John the Baptist. He's the one who wanted to talk to Jesus, and on the night of his betrayal and before his crucifixion, he interviewed him, and Jesus didn't speak to Herod Antipas at all. This is the Herod at the end of the gospel accounts, as well as the Herod who killed John. His uncle Herod Antipas, when he was banished because of his misdeeds and distrust on the part of the Roman emperor, Herod Antipas was banished in 39 AD, and then Herod Agrippa I was given not only the tetrarchies of Philip and Lysanias, but also the tetrarchy of Herod Antipas, which means that now, at the time of this story, in about 44 AD, Herod Agrippa I is ruler over the very same territory that his grandfather, Herod the Great, had ruled over. And he has the same title. He is Herod the King, as his grandfather had been. The Emperor Claudius was a boyhood friend of Herod Agrippa I, and in AD 41, when Claudius began to rule in Rome, he expanded the territory of Agrippa to include Judea, Samaria, the whole of the territory that Herod the Great had ruled over. Herod Agrippa I was written of with admiration by the rabbis. He was not a good man. He was not a godly man. There is abundant evidence to that effect. But he was very pragmatic. And because of his pragmatism, he was looked at with admiration by many of the Jewish rulers, many of the Jewish authorities, the rabbis. And they wrote very fondly of the rule of Herod Agrippa I. Because he made a great show when he was in Jerusalem, he made a great show of adherence to the law. And when he was away from Jerusalem, he lived like a Roman pagan. But when he was in Jerusalem, he made a great show of respect for the law. Knowing his own family history of hostile relationships with the Jewish people, he is a descendant, after all, of Esau. He is an Edomite and Idumean by paternal descent. And knowing the history of hostile relationships of the various Herods with the Jewish people, he made great efforts to win the affection and the admiration of the Jews of Judea. And he enjoyed great success in his maneuvering to do so. He was, as I said, a very practical man, a pragmatist. Not a good manager, not good with fiscal responsibility, not morally upright, but very pragmatic. It was to his advantage to have a successful reign with the cooperation of loyal subjects, to keep the Roman peace, the Pax Romana. He tried to preserve the status quo, and Christians were not a part of the status quo. The priests, the ruling priests of Jerusalem, the Pharisees, the rabbis, none of them liked the Christians. Consequently, the Christians went on the list, as far as he was concerned, of people to be suppressed. They were inherently troublemakers. They were not keepers of the status quo. And so in Acts chapter 12, verse 2, he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. Now, that was particularly a Roman form of execution. James, the brother of John, is mentioned many times in the Gospels, always in conjunction with his brother John. Those two men are always side by side in the Gospel accounts. Despite the English rendering of the name James, James, the brother of John, the Greek name here is actually Jacob, Jacobus. And I don't know just why back in the 15th, 16th centuries, English translators decided to call these men James, because that's not a transliteration of the name of James, the brother of Jesus, James, the brother of John, or James, the other apostle. Every one of those, their name is actually Jacob. They're named after their forefather, the patriarch Jacob. That's in the Greek text. It's in virtually every language except English. But in English, they're called James for whatever reason. Jacob. The Hebrew name Jacob is the name that we're looking at here. And we can only guess as to why the translators in past centuries decided, the English translators that is, to make the name James. But whenever you see the name James in the New Testament, it's really that old name Jacob, the progenitor of Israel, remembered among his children, his offspring. So besides this man, referred to as James in our English, besides this James, the brother of John, we do also have James, Jacob, the son of Alphaeus, among the apostles. We also have James, the brother of Jesus. Jesus was the son of Mary, and legally his father was Joseph. James was the son of Mary and Joseph, along with a couple of other brothers and a sister. We also have James, the father, Jacob, James, the father of one of the apostles. There was an apostle named Judas, not Iscariot, whose father was named James. But after this execution in Acts chapter 12, verse 2, the only James who comes back to our attention again is James, the half-brother of Jesus. We read about him several times in Acts, including here in the 12th chapter of Acts. He's going to be mentioned a little further down the story as an important leader in the Jerusalem church. He's going to be named as being one among the elders of the Jerusalem church. James, the half-brother of Jesus, is the only James after this who's mentioned, who's brought to our attention in the New Testament. Mentioned not only in Acts, but he wrote the letter that bears his name, James, Jacob, James, and also mentioned by Paul in the 2nd chapter of Galatians, and referenced by Paul, though not mentioned by name, but mentioned as the Lord's brothers in the 9th chapter of 1 Corinthians. So, James and John, this James, the James here in Acts 12, this is James, the brother of John. the sons of Zebedee. They were two of the four fishermen who were the first to be called by Jesus to follow him. Mark chapter 1, verse 19. Jesus on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee in the region in the area of Capernaum, the city of Capernaum, he called Peter and Andrew and James and John from their fishing to be his followers. This is that James. And they lived in Jerusalem. They worked alongside Peter and Andrew. They had known Peter and Andrew before they knew Jesus. They were longtime co-workers. They were partners in fishing business, and they were clearly friends. Jesus nicknamed James and John the sons of thunder, giving us some notion of their boisterous spirit. That's in Mark 3:17. It was the sons of thunder. It was James and John who proposed calling fire from heaven to destroy a Samaritan village that didn't welcome Jesus in Luke 9:54. That brought about a rebuke from Jesus. It was the same James and John with their mother who asked Jesus if they could sit on his right hand and his left hand in the kingdom in Mark 10:35, raising the ire of their fellow apostles. The other 10 were upset with them because of that request, and Jesus told them they couldn't have it. On several occasions, James and John saw what few others saw, including a time when the two of them, along with Peter, were taken into a room and witnessed Jesus raising a dead child to life in Mark 5:37. Peter, James, and John were the only one that Jesus allowed in that room. And it was only Peter and James and John who went up on the mountain where Jesus was transfigured to see him radiant, glorified, and conversing with Moses and Elijah in Mark chapter 9, verse 2. It was James and John, along with Peter and Andrew, who are named in Mark chapter 13 and verse 3, who were sitting with Jesus on the Mount of Olives and asked him, when will these things be? That is, the throwing down of the stones of Jerusalem in the temple and the sign of his coming in the end of the age. Peter, Andrew, James, and John were the four, specifically named in Mark 13:3 for that conversation with Jesus. And on the night of his betrayal, Jesus took aside, he took the 11, because Judas had already left them at the supper. He took the 11 disciples with him across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives, and there at Gethsemane in the garden, he told all of the disciples to pray, but he took Peter, James, and John aside with him and particularly exhorted them to be watchful and to pray in Mark 14:33, there at Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. This James, the brother of John, was part of the innermost circle of Jesus' companions and disciples. Despite all that they had experienced of persecution in the dozen or so years since Jesus rose and sent the Spirit, it had to be a cataclysmic shock for the church and for all of the apostles when James was executed Roman style with a sword. In Acts chapter 5, verse 17, if you recall, the apostles had been arrested and put in prison, but the Lord intervened, and a spirit and an angel set them free from that prison and told them to go in the temple and preach. It wasn't the first time the apostles had faced threatening circumstances, but this is the first time one of them had actually suffered the violence of execution, had actually been put to death. And this had to be especially a hard blow to these close companions, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. They'd been friends for years before they even began to follow Jesus. They had been close associates in that inner circle, especially Peter, James, and John, during the ministry of Jesus. And it had to be an especially difficult blow to those men. And hardest of all for John himself. Although John certainly believed in the Lord and knew about the resurrection life, he's the one who writes about the raising of Lazarus and Jesus being the resurrection and the life in the Gospel of John. He certainly believed that, but still the pain of seeing his brother, almost certainly his older brother, put to death in this fashion, and the confusion that went along with this. Because up until now, God had always rescued his apostles. Up until now, God had always delivered them from death. But he allowed Herod to kill James. And when we read John writing about friendship, Jesus calling his disciples friends, and we have John described as the apostle of love, this is the same one who had said, let's call down fire from heaven, one of the sons of thunder, and destroy that village of Samaritans that rejected Jesus. He's the one who writes that no one has greater love than that a man would lay down his life for his friends. He's the one who writes that anyone who hates his brother has no love in him. He knew very well what it was to lose a brother. He knew very well what it was to love a brother from a purely physical kind of family relationship, but even more so to have those tight bonds of fellowship in Jesus. John knew the sorrow and struggle of losing someone who was very near and dear to him. And I have to wonder what Peter and John and the others thought when James' life was taken and they still continued on. Why him? Why not me? We ask those kinds of questions ourselves whenever someone is taken too soon, as James had been taken here. Acts chapter 12, verse 3, when Herod Agrippa the first, saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread. Again, this is the way Herod Agrippa behaved. He wanted to please his political base in Jerusalem and Judea. He wanted popular support. This was part of his strategy to keep the Roman peace. Christians were disrupted by their very existence. They were disrupted, not because they stirred violence, but because they were the objects of violence. Their doctrines were controversial. The fact that he arrested and killed James first suggests that James was a very active leader among the apostles and in the Jerusalem church. Luke doesn't tell us any stories of James' activities in these first 12 chapters. After chapter 1, when he's mentioned as being among the apostles, this is the first time he's come up again. But clearly he was very active, or he would not have been the first one who was picked up when Herod decided to take action against the Christians in Jerusalem. His exploits are not a part of Luke's story, but clearly he was a man of influence among the Christians. Herod saw that it pleased the Jews. This was very important to this king who ruled under Roman authority and wanted to keep his place, wanted to maintain the status quo. This happened, it says, during the days of unleavened bread. That is to say, Passover. And the word Passover comes up again very shortly in the text. During the time of the Passover. The week-long feast connected with Passover, going back to the story of Passover being initiated in the 12th chapter of the book of Exodus. They had the Passover observance with the lamb, and then they had 7 days of unleavened bread following the Passover. Now, this is about 12 to 14 years after Jesus had been arrested. Again, we can't nail it down, absolute confident, either the year that Jesus was crucified, maybe 30, maybe 29, maybe 33. I tend to think 33, but we can't be absolutely certain what year. And we can't be absolutely certain, except that we have good testimony that Herod the king died in 44 AD. And so this has to be in proximity to 43 or 44 AD. It's in that general time frame. This was about 12 to 14 years after Jesus had been after Jesus had been arrested and then executed and then raised from the dead. And that all happened at Passover. Something the apostles in the church remembered regularly in the first day of the week observance of the Lord's Supper. They remembered this regularly. And yet, knowing human nature, I can't help but think there was a especially strong recollection whenever Passover came around for those who knew Jesus personally and intimately. Because when you lose someone who's close to you, someone who's been a strong influence in your life, and a year rolls around, there's a tendency to remember that with a special fervency, with a special potency. And so this may have been even more strongly felt by the church because Peter now has been arrested at Passover during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it's essentially an anniversary, 12 or 14 years or so after the crucifixion of Jesus. The timing of Peter's arrest may have seemed especially ominous to those in the church who had been present when Jesus was arrested and killed on that earlier Passover. Acts 12:4, when Herod had seized Peter, he put him in prison, delivering him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out to the people. Herod, like other rulers before him, didn't want to stir up the massive crowds of Jewish pilgrims present in Jerusalem during Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That wasn't a time to do controversial things or things that would cause excitable crowds to get out of hand. So he imprisoned Peter for a few days until the festival uproar was over. But he did intend to make a public spectacle of Peter's trial for the local authorities and population, and Peter's certain execution after the trial. The trial was only for the sake of bringing condemnation and putting him to death. Luke says he was put in charge of 4 squads of soldiers. The 4 squads here, the tetrahedron, according to Roman reckoning, a night was divided into 4 watches. That's mentioned in some other scriptures, but the night was divided into 4 watches. The first watch was from 6 to 9 p.m., the second watch from 9 to midnight, the third watch from midnight to 3, and the fourth watch from 3 to 6 a.m. And so 4 squads of soldiers would take turns in rotation through the night to watch Peter. 1 company of 4 soldiers for each of the 4 watches of the night. 16 soldiers altogether, rotating 4 at a time every 3 hours. Acts 12:5. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. Many have tried to guess exactly where Peter was imprisoned in Jerusalem. Probably it was in the Roman garrison of the Antonia fortress next to the temple. But it's just a guess because Luke doesn't give us that particular information. Instead, what Luke emphasized here is the earnest prayers of the church on Peter's behalf. The church was engaged in earnest prayer for Peter. Now, remember, when Peter and John had first been arrested and threatened by the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem back in Acts chapter 4, after the healing of the lame man in the temple area, the response of the disciples, when Peter and John were released, was an appeal to the Lord to give them boldness and power to preach the word. The prayerful response of the church to challenges, to threats, and to fear is a frequent theme in the book of Acts. When Christians saw trouble, they prayed. They engaged in fervent prayer to God. Acts chapter 12, verses 6 through 11 tells us of how Peter was rescued from the prison by an angel at the last minute. Now, when Herod was about to bring him out, I'm reading Acts 12, 6 through 11. Now, when Herod was about to bring him out on that very night, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers bound with 2 chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to him, and a light shone in the cell. He, the angel, struck Peter on the side and woke him, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his hands, and the angel said to him, "Dress yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And he went out and followed him. He did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. When they had passed through the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate leading into the city. It opened for them of its own accord, and they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel left him. When Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I am sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." So in 12:6, Herod was about to bring him out on that very night, the night before the morning when Herod was going to present him for public execution. Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers. It is evident from the time of the arrest to the very night before Peter was to be brought out for trial and death. Several days had passed. And it's kind of important to remember that when we read about how the believers responded in what happens in this storyline. This had gone on for several days. Peter was arrested during the feast. He was kept in prison for several days. And then on the very night before he was to be brought out for trial and execution, that's when the Lord acted. But days had gone by. Days during which the church had been earnestly praying. This is now the last minute, as it were. And as we'll see in verse 12, believers were still gathering to pray throughout that night. Don't forget, as we read, as we think about this story, for us, it's a few minutes of reading. But for them, it was days of distress and earnest prayers, and they had just recently lost James, and they had to see Peter as being in imminent jeopardy. The Lord had allowed James to die. Perhaps he was going to allow Peter to die as well. They couldn't know what to expect, but they kept on praying during those days of uncertainty. Remember, too, that what we have described here with the 4 squads of 4 soldiers at a time, do you think Herod was afraid of a jailbreak? You suppose he thought the Christians of Jerusalem would rouse together and go and break Peter out of the prison? Free Peter by violence? There was zero history of violence on the part of the Christian community. None of the apostles, none of the disciples had responded in violence to the persecution that they had experienced. There was no evidence, no inclination, no suggestion that that kind of path would be followed. Instead, I think it's likely that Herod had heard of the incident in Acts chapter 5 when the apostles all exited the temple jail where the Sanhedrin had incarcerated them, and no one knew how they got out. And he wanted no embarrassing empty cell. He wanted to make sure that no one bribed a soldier. No telling how he explained away that former incident. It's unlikely that he saw the hand of God in this. But nevertheless, he put himself in direct opposition to the hand of God. He wanted no empty cell. Good publicity was the point, not the embarrassment of a man who got away. So there were 2 soldiers of the 4 that were guarding him during that hour of the night. There were 2 soldiers who were chained to Peter. There were 2 more soldiers at the door. And this is not the first time that human rulers tried to prevent divine action by posting a guard or putting a seal on a tomb. Verse 7, behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to Peter, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him, saying, get up quickly. And the chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, dress yourself and put on your sandals. And he did so. And he said to him, wrap your cloak around you and follow me. So indeed, a jailbreak is in progress here. At the last minute, while there are still disciples praying, not knowing what to expect, days have gone by, but indeed an angel of the Lord intervenes in the scene. Sometimes an angel of the Lord looks like a man. This angel of the Lord appeared with a bright light shining around him. And we'll pick up with the account here of how the jailbreak proceeds from Acts chapter 12, verse 7, in our next video next time. But in the meantime, understand that when you pray, God listens. The answer doesn't always come in the time frame you expect or in the way you expect, but when you pray, if you're a follower of Jesus, God listens. And sometimes he answers our prayers in ways that are quite unexpected. And we'll see how that follows through in the remainder of the story here in Acts chapter 12 next time. Acts 12:7.